Nothing significant is not happening. In the south, the offensive continues. Here we still have the opportunity for respite. Slowly, step by step, we shed our stupor like a tight suit. We now realize how blind and unfeeling winter has made us. It is more than what could have been allowed to happen. I walked through a gap in the back of the room at the NP, letting the young branches whip around my arms, and stopped for a while in a clearing. A ridge of clouds stretched from the north across the pale evening sky. How vast is the sky over Russia! Day after day, the bullets of machine gun bursts whistle over our shelter. At night, their whistle echoes sharply in the forest. Nothing happens. Then someone gets up and comes out of the dugout, and a few seconds later, he is already dead. The night was quiet. Only a single line sounded, but it hit him. You say, "Damn it, he was a good guy." And the next day you see a wreath made by the guys, with bunches of red spruce cones as open wounds. You see his face again, just like when he came out of the dugout. Then it turns dark. For a short time, Eschit. Brown came into our sector, and today he leaves us. Brown was in charge of the machine gun squad near my observation post. He stayed awake while I slept. Our reports complemented each other. In the evening, I would pass him music I intercepted somewhere in the positions, and neither of us drank our schnapps alone. He was an ace who managed to set fire to the dugouts at P and burned the last of the barns. With iron calmness, he fired bursts of tracer bullets, leaning against a tree, aiming range 600, coup after coup at the same point until it began to smoke. Yesterday, Brown said, "What volunteers to go out on patrol? I must. I've been on enough." But today he was cursing because he didn't go out there. At night, they found the Russian firing positions empty. They went through the dugouts and were spoken to by a Russian sentry in the passageway who didn't realize who was coming. There are other men who, with rifles on their belts, tunics unbuttoned, and pilots askew, make their way through the countryside. There is something in the look in their eyes that sets them apart from all the others. You recognize them immediately. They are the ones who fight the war. They are indestructible. They loom everywhere, getting involved in every enterprise. Danger attracts them. They like to play with death. They're rare. They are too fast, too skillful, too determined. They master the game and run it for a long time. Then they too often break the rules of the game, or they meet a worthy opponent. One field flubble hit 28 tanks in close combat. Then he went up on the turret to the commander of the 29th with only a pistol in his hand. He was a second too late. They fired at the same time, and both were killed. Such men are hard to get along with in the rear, but at the front, if they fall into the hands of a good officer, they can turn a company into a first-class fighting unit, because their fighting spirit and courageous decisions are transmitted to all the others. Courage and courage are contagious, just as cowardice is. In the evening came long reports of enemy activity. They completed the picture. The attack was expected. It began at 3 o'clock. The enemy opened fire with all means at his disposal, blinding our observation points, shelling artillery positions, concentrating fire on our bridgehead and our. Almost immediately, the wire lines of communication froze. The report of the attack came over the radio. The reception was poor. We opened barrage fire blindly, oriented to the noise of battle, intensifying around our. At dawn, we went outside and watched the black smoke from shell bursts at the edge of the woods creeping toward our firing positions. One man was wounded in the artillery positions. About 120 medium-caliber shells fell near the NP. We opened barrage fire with all our might, firing from 800 to 1,000 rounds, but it was actually said to have been nearly 2,000, and half of them on our. Our own losses were not heavy, and later the NP reported that the assault on R had been thwarted by the fire of our battery. The supply echelon arrived at 4.00. At 14.00 in rain and snow, we loaded onto the train. A log road led to the railroad station. There was a temporary loading platform. The bulky Russian railroad cars were badly damaged. The steam locomotive was gigantic. The rain whipped through muddy puddles. The wind rattled the telegraph wires. The gun crews rose with mud on their arms and chests. But without haste and without delay, car after car rolled up the sloping platform. Guns and gun fronts, communications wagons, chancery wagons, a blacksmith shop, field kitchens, and light transportation. I still remember how we shook our heads when we got our first local van when we were still at Combe. It was a type of vehicle with a louvered body side extension, the kind that farmers use to haul hay. We painted the car gray to make it look a little like a military vehicle, but we were always ashamed of it, and we had to ride at the very end of the convoy, like a gypsy kibitka. And today all the movable property of the vast army is loaded almost exclusively on such wagons. The high wagons on which the French used to carry forage have long been forgotten. The wagons we have now are even smaller. They are wretched, shabby, little spring-loaded two-horse wagons. But they go through all kinds of mud, and if they get stuck up to their axles, a couple of horses can easily pull them out. With a friendly 1-2, got it, the artilleryman can lift the loaded wagon and put it in place. Next on the inclined platform went the horses, 5 pairs per open goods platform. Everything went smoothly with an old experienced team on our battery. And we rolled westward. In R, we saw trains loaded with new guns and farm machinery, instruments of war and peace. After all the destruction, the hand of the owner was already felt here. Even the smallest stations had some semblance of a garden with grass, trees, and paths, and even where half a house had been demolished, the infantrymen had made their own little gardens and front lawns. We moved along the corridor within range of enemy batteries. Once we saw 2 black mushroom-shaped pillars of explosions 200 meters from the tracks, but because of the noise of the train we could hardly hear the sounds of the explosions. Sometime at dawn we heard the rumble of a diving airplane, but it was making a raid somewhere off to the side. A short while later Fieldfebel Weiss boarded the train. Meeting Sergeant Conrad, he asked him, "Anything going on?" "Absolutely nothing," replied Conrad, "except that last night we repelled another attack, 1,000 rounds of medium caliber fire. That's about all, I guess." Half an hour later the field fleet happened to be at the division's temporary headquarters and heard the following there. Fantastic story. The Russians have broken through with tanks and motorized infantry. 2,000 shells were fired on our sector, but the 11th and 12th batteries made good progress. That's how exponentially some news can be inflated according to the distance in miles from the front line. We proceeded to the end of the corridor, so to speak, to the nail of the finger to which another finger reaches out in an endeavor to close the ring. Between them, there is a gap of about 80 kilometers, but the enemy cannot make much use of it. The terrain is not favorable. It is bare and monotonous. As far as the eye can see, there is nothing but steppe with stunted trees and mixed forests. The pathetic little villages on the hills look even more dismal in the rain, as black as the marshes on which they stand. Even on a hill, if you dig with a shovel, water immediately appears in the wet, black, marshy soil. The vehicles get deeply stuck in the swamp, and we have to harness 4 horses to each wagon. They say the Russians have to carry their ammunition 30 kilometers. At least we have a railroad instead of having to haul it all on our backs. It's a strange war being fought here, with strongholds and armed convoys, with small surprise raids, and no distinct front line, with paratroopers dropping in and airplanes attacking at a breakneck speed. All in all, it is rather flawed, with neither side putting on an impressive show. It seems that the Russians can't, and we don't want to. A wagtail nestles in the gun cradle of the heavy gun battery we are unloading. At 2 o'clock, I returned to the empty train bound for Smolensk and Minsk, according to my travel orders. I settled down in the straw, which smelled of horses. From Vyazma, I traveled in a German wagon with a timbre. At Smolensk, I arrived 24 hours later. At 9 o'clock, I found Henning. It was not easy. First, I went through the backyard of the workshop, then through the garden. At the end of it, I saw someone standing with his hand over his eyes. It was a grand encounter. On July 11 at 11 o'clock, I set out for Minsk. I got to the airfield in the movie studio's Mercedes. I could not drive up to the airplane, but an airfield car gave me a lift. Later I transferred to a truck, and by 6 o'clock in the evening I was taken to the Tot organization camp between Orsha and Borisov. A clean room, a well with clean ice water, and in another 20 minutes I was just in time for a performance by a Russian troupe that called itself goodbye. The end of our first year. It is not particularly remarkable to us. We mention it as if in passing, with a half smile. No reason to be cheerful, no reason to be sad either. The day is like any other. It is not worth talking about. We are part of this war. It's a natural phenomenon. It is born and it grows, and when it runs out, it dies. In the beginning, it was we who carried it with us. Now it is we who are carried by the war. We started it, but in the end it entered us and made us its puppets. It has burned much in us, and it will continue to take it out of us until it forces us to be reborn. It is useless to fight it. One cannot look back. It will only sadden and leave bitterness in the heart. The only thing left is to leave the soul to this force and reconcile it with her. It is stronger still, but it will pass like rain. June 30, 1942. For 8 days I have been roaming the country from hopeless areas to more prosperous ones, and from prosperous ones to those where things are really good, as far as such places can exist in wartime. There is hardly any transportation on a dirt road or railroad that I have not used. At first it was as if life had come to a standstill. Freight trains crawled through the countryside, and then it took a military echelon 7 hours to cover 60 kilometers. The scenery outside the window was always the same. How tired I was of these muddy roads. I can't bear to see them anymore. Rain, mud up to my ankles, villages that look like one another. I don't even want to know their names. And then there are those horrible little towns where the only paved road leads to the station, and nowhere else. Even if one wanted to do something about it, it would only make sense in peacetime. It got better on the way to Smolensk. I made a bed of straw on the floor of an open freight car. The sun was shining, and I slept comfortably on my bedding. It was that evening that I found Henning. I had viewed the marvelous icons on my last visit to the church. Other than that, there wasn't much to see in a city turned into ruins that once housed one of the largest universities and 34 high schools and technical schools. The church is now, after a hiatus of 5 years, holding services again. Apart from this, what else can be said about Smolensk? Some episodes remain in the mind if you pay closer attention to them. Emigrants, refugees, women and children with knots behind their backs. There were hundreds of them, moving in unsteady columns, and above their heads a loudspeaker would suddenly burst forth with solemn, deafening music. Here a face with regular features would emerge. There a clean-shaven head would peer out of white shirts belted with narrow straps and tucked into loincloths. Sometimes a modestly dressed beautiful girl would walk along the road without looking to the right or left. Such pictures are exceptions, but they make you think. When I was driving to the airfield, we met a column of prisoners, yesterday's soldiers in a state of apathy, with the hunted look of the defeated. On the other side of the street, women were standing and crying. One does not often see tears. As a rule, they are not part of the Russian character. Henning told me a story illustrating this fact. They had a woman who did the cleaning and her brother helped her. The brother committed theft and was incriminated. After a speedy trial, he was shot. The woman was not told about this, but she knew it. When someone once asked her about Vasil, she said, "Vasil stole." She considered the harsh punishment perfectly natural and shrugged her shoulders. Later she was told, "You be careful, don't steal." She calmly replied, "Nothing. It's war." I wandered the streets, looking at the girls, the life of the squares, and the many churches. Sometimes I sat down on a bench in the park where children were playing. One day I got into a droshky to get a better look around the city. There was something unreal about being a guest, a stranger in an already foreign city. There was a dining room where a Russian waiter asked in German, "Beer, sir?" Each time he put a new shot of vodka in front of me. Then there was the chapel over the passageway under the arch with the Black Madonna. On big holidays, she is dressed up in stiff, shiny gold robes. Candles lit around her to greet the huddling crowds below. After an exhausting journey, I reached Minsk in an ammunition train at 3:30 in the morning. At 4:30, I swung over the fence and met my old comrade Julius of the Thug Company. At breakfast, he ate half a pound of butter, 3/4 of a pound of blood sausage, and a scrambled egg of 7 eggs. I could hardly have handled all that. In the afternoon, I set out for Borisov, where 10 hours' sleep helped me to recover from the tedium of the journey and the cold in my head. I encamped in a small black house where I had stayed once before. It was during the offensive. I had stopped then to wash up from the road, and I liked the house very much. At first the family was not particularly pleased with my second visit, but after a while a shy smile appeared on the faces of the hosts, and we established trust in each other. The family consisted of a quiet, shy woman, a wrinkled grandmother, and little Panika, who was 14 years old. It was easy enough if you acted carefully, showing friendliness to people and trying to push aside war. It was as if one excluded the other. In a soldier's dormitory in Ness, I was waiting for a mail courier from Berlin. It was pouring rain outside. It was a relief after the stuffiness of the last few days. Last night, it had been so stuffy that I was sweating with all my pores. A country of extremes. There is no moderation in anything. Heat and cold, dust and dirt. Everything is furious and unbridled. Isn't it to be expected that the people here are like that? Several Russian polizei sat at my table, young Ukrainians from Galicia. Some of them still wore their brown serge coats with brass buttons emblazoned with the emblem of the hammer and sickle. Others wore German uniforms without emblems and Russian waist belts. Such a ridiculous mishmash. But they're good guys, brave, desperate, and full of hate. Just what we need. There were many destroyed buildings in the city. The Bolsheviks had burned all the houses. Only their hulks remained. Some had been destroyed by bombing, in many cases by arson. Now the buildings have been put in order again. Roofs, floors, walls, staircases, windows, doors, balconies, everything has been renewed. The main workshops and supply companies should have good quarters for the winter. July 12, 1942. Back in the old company again. How nice it was for me to see again the little valley with the river and the good old dugouts on the hillside. "So, you have arrived," remarked the battery commander. "We wondered if anything had happened to you. And I felt sort of like the prodigal son. It's probably hard to understand. But on the last stretch of the road I felt as if I were coming home. On the way there was a big mine crater, burnt-out wagons, shell craters to the right and left of the railroad, a hit plane, a sloping track, the last loading place, and finally, the shack of the commandant loading into the echelon. It was all so familiar as the noise of the front at night, as the light from the dugouts off the road. Now I had calmed down again. I had heard from reports that something was happening in our sector, that we had to straighten our defense line to avoid being in the cauldron, and that worried me. But it turned out that everything was fine, nothing had changed. The only news was that Bud was wounded, promoted to sergeant, awarded the Iron Cross of the First Degree, and sent home for a visit. The boys gathered in my dugout. The light of the pale evening sky streamed in through the keysy curtains on the window, and I was reading. I had a letter from Yo, who was in the south, and another from Martin, who was in the north. I was deeply moved. How scattered are my friends, in all theaters of war, in Norway, on the Leningrad front, in Army Group Center, in the Donets Basin in southern France, in Greece and Africa, on the coasts, on occupied islands, in deserts, steppes and forests, among snowy mountains, and within the walls of foreign cities. And yet they speak the same way. Their hearts beat in the same rhythm. Here is Martin writing. I see him drinking and pounding his fist on the table. If only it were possible to start living again and keep doing my work. I'm still not abandoning my dreams. We'll realize them eventually. I found some beautiful icons. That's for the future. Right now, I'm pretty drunk. And here's Yo, sitting outside his house writing about these strange times. On a strand of spider web hanging from the eaves, a straw sways in the wind. The cat, Peter Jr., sits on the edge of a chair in the sunshine. It is Sunday morning. A faint bluish smoke from the kitchen rises and walks among the trees, and the clouds cast huge shadows on the surrounding landscape. It's marvelous. A combination of soft blue with white and yellow and pink. That's the gamut of colors I'm living in at the moment. I guess it's a reward for the horrible first half of May when the tanks broke through here. We repulsed the power station twice, and the valley was so black with smoke you couldn't see the sky itself. Our cemetery with the crosses is getting bigger and bigger, and when all the commotion and confusion subsides, I again have the sad duty of writing letters on the white wooden boards. Now they have already turned gray under the overhanging irises. So writes Yo. Here by the battery the fine rain is drizzling in the evening sun. The air is very clear, and the soft light lays down on the grass. I just took a deep breath. There are flowers on the slope of our dugout, as well as on the table inside it. The dugout is bright and cozy, like a small living room. 350 Russians had made a breakthrough and were advancing somewhere in the countryside. Toward evening, shots were heard in the rear. The sentries are doubling up, but none of this can disturb the peace of the Lord God. Since yesterday afternoon I have been at the MP, headed to the old observation post to see how the terrain had changed. I wandered through a meadow, white with yarrow and daisies, and came upon a sunny slope with strawberries. I stayed there so long that my companions began to worry. I couldn't tear myself away. My greed for strawberries was incredible. Here they were, red, ripe and plump. All I had to do was to put my hand up and fill my mouth. I threw aside my cap and waist belt and bent down to pick them. Soon my hands were red from the juice. Then went to the L. There were many new shell craters, and the dugout had been directly hit. As I approached, I heard the noise of a fierce battle. The next moment I saw a group of our guys in their steel helmets spinning around in a frenzied dance, throwing hand grenades. All in all, it presented a fantastic spectacle. They seemed to be using every conceivable means to confound the Russians. As it turned out, the division commander arrived at L, and it was he who was conferring at company headquarters as to whether it was worth the risk of advancing further. Ours had set up a Russian machine gun and were firing from it at the Russian platoon's own position. The Russians were upset that our commander had not fallen into the trap. With great care, they had attached a stretching wire to the mine, hoping that the German general would snag it and detonate the mine. Now they detonated it themselves and set fire to the barn in the process. When the big man left, it became quiet at once. We laughed. The big guns have gone silent. Now it's midnight. I'm sitting and writing by candlelight. Outside machine guns are firing, and behind me someone shouts, 10 more shots, fire. What's the vertical aim? 7,100. Then he turned with a sigh. Not far away, if you go outside, you can see flashes over the new front line, ringing a large neighborhood. It's raining. It's been raining day and night. The boardwalk in front of our house squelches, sinking beneath our feet into puddles. But there's one advantage. We don't get called out on patrol. Also, the flies have quieted down. Flies that carry dirt on everything and everyone and rise in clouds as soon as you take off the clothes hanging on the wall by the stove. The evening is very calm. A light mist has descended over the lowlands, and the roofs of the houses seem to float in the pale light. Somewhere a cart creaks, horses beat their hoofs in the stalls, and the clinking of chains can be heard. It's quiet all around, as if the front were taking a breather for a while. You sit here in the blockhouse, far from all the worries, among the marshy forests, between machine gun firing points, each of which is connected to the next by a narrow boardwalk. The sentries are silent. They try not to take any chances. There are too many rabble in the woods. We had to shoot through the woods, making a kind of passageway, a necessary space between the enemy and us. It's a different world, and I'm grateful for it. In times like these, the front is the best place to be. It's not that there's always a lot of things to do. Sometimes there's very little, and one has to learn to be alone with oneself. I like that. At the front you are incredibly free, freed from petty worries and troubles, from the inevitable sticky things you can't do anything about. Just as military orders are short and precise, and there is no doubt about the feasibility of our task, there are no problems with things outside of the daily routine. Aside from a small number of things common to all of us, such as the desire to get home again one day and thoughts of those we love, we forget about everything else. We don't have time to think about other things, to get involved in other things. Here I can wander through the forest, experiencing only the bliss of the green twilight after the blinding sun on a clear day. I can sit at the monumental entrance to my blockhouse, enjoying the smell of resin and the warmth of a sunny day that fills the forest with great waves of meadow scent. The sickness of our time can be reduced to a few formulas. It occurs to me that we can think about it much better here, outside the noise of daily life, when we are not distracted from quiet reflection by wishful thinking. And here we are free even from desires. They have become too meaningless before the uncertainty of tomorrow. Nothing stands between us and the majesty of the course of events. By 2:00 a.m., someone burst in with a shout of "Wake up!" By 3 o'clock, the main marching outpost was already moving along black marshy roads, through swamp with rising vapors, and over terrain with flat uplands and dark villages. I am always impressed by this landscape with its vastness and the sheer scope of its actual boundaries. This morning there was nothing but the dark ribbon of the road, the green of the meadow almost as dark in the cold light. The fog floated faintly between the hills, and the villages also floated on its crests. There was no variety, no charm. The same harsh tone dominated everything, so that a lone rider could be swallowed up by it and yet remain visible from afar as a separate thing. The gun carriage got stuck in the swamp, and for some time there was nothing among the hills but a group of artillerymen, teams in charge of horses, tow ropes, and hoisting devices around the hapless gun loom, and a loud, determined 1-2, taken. The battery stretched out along the road. From the hills, the machines could be seen moving their way forward, up a rise, or coming around a bend. Then followed the usual practice of boarding the train, shoulder to shoulder, splendidly coordinated, then rolled on in an easterly direction. During the many stops we chatted or good-naturedly bickered. Laughter echoed from car to car. I took a little nap on a hay bale under our wagon. We are glad of the sunshine during this interlude, when we can sleep, when everything is prepared, and we are just being moved to where we are needed. We used to revere this job, the upheaval, the new change of places, because it is human nature to be lazy and stay in one place. But we have already accepted it and forgotten about it. Soon we will build new positions, not for the first time, and not for the last time. We will do what is required, and soon we will feel at home again. It won't require much, for we are essentially nomads. Then we will live in the present again, and all of this will remain just another episode of the past. We drove into the unknown of a night filled with the roar of cars. Parachute rockets were falling from under the clouds. The ground shook with heavy explosions. Incendiary bombs erupted. The fire of anti-aircraft artillery, bright flashes of rockets in the darkness fired from rocket launchers, artillery duels. The entire battlefield framed by a semicircle of flickering signal lights, constantly changing in their silent message. We are here, comrades, we are here. The endless cry of the wide-open front line. We kept moving toward it. The mud glistened dimly like lead in the light of the flashes. The clatter of hoofs echoed rumblingly along the road. The ruins of a dead town appeared, where the only living things were the sweet smell of smoke and ourselves, the masters of this land, having come so far from the other, where our women and children lived. We continued on our way in the morning. I made the same journey 3 times. Only the creaking of saddles and the clattering of stirrups could be heard. There came an hour of utter indifference, when one became blind and deaf, unable to think of anything but sleep. Then came another hour, a moment when one can sink into the stream and come to one's senses, when one feels a little better, except that one's eyes are still half closed and sensitive to light, and one's throat is dry with intolerable dryness. My horse roared through the morning. She's always bellowing. You can see her from a distance. She is small and strong. Her voice is hoarse and rough, and when she gives it, her ugly face reminds me of the works of Leonardo da Vinci, so repulsive and yet making such a strong impression. Not an hour goes by during the day that the air is not filled with the roar of fighter planes and dive bombers. The Junkers 87 returned, flying low overhead. Being in high spirits, its pilot turned on his dive siren. Our horses went mad, but we still appreciated the camaraderie. There is always a feeling of great unconscious joy when two different branches of the military meet in a common operation. The pilots wave at us from above, and we look up with our heads up and wave back. We are moving into a new area, and we can hear the mud and water squelching under our feet. The mosquitoes clung around the horses' necks in what looked like ruby red necklaces. When we got back from the new NP, the artillery echelon was just rolling up the last gun. The screams of the drivers echoed in the empty space between the two villages. In the background, the horror of the gehenna of fire continued. Monstrous columns of smoke, dark, white, and purple, to which more were being added all the time, rose into the sky, the result of merciless shelling that shook the ground and made the panes on the windows rattle. Squadrons of our and enemy airplanes clipped each other in the air. Ours were numerous. A Russian bomber was blown apart by a violent explosion, and flaming debris rained down from a cloud of smoke. August 22, 1942. 7.00. For an hour and a half we were under hurricane fire. Rocket volleys, heavy mortar hits, tanks. 5 times attacked fighter planes. Tanks broke through from the left flank. A direct hit on the NP. The telephone was shattered, but there were no other losses. Fire control moved to our personal dugout. Several tanks in front of our position, all burning. Concentrated charges at the ready. We will use hand grenades and submachine gun in close combat within range. The main blow is struck on the adjacent sector, 500 meters to the left. 7.30. Brutal barrage fire. Caught in a funnel, staining with mud all the back. Mortars and Katyusha. 8.00. Infantry attacking on the northern edge of the forest. Fire shaft, Ludwig. The enemy battery changes position on the slope to the southeast, running out of ammunition. The fire is conducted by Rosenberger 3. 8.20. Our own battery is working again, using delayed action shells. All guns open fire on the infantry at the edge of the woods. 8.25. Finally, dive bombers. We fire rocket launchers, indicating targets. 8.30. Hooray, they're diving. 8.35. Fighter bombers are coming into action, bombs and machine guns. Visibility is reduced by the explosions. There, on the Russian positions, evacuate the first wounded. 9.00. The company advances to the southeast corner of B. Now there are 2 companies, mounted artillery, cargo transport. Order to open fire. Main line of fire 235 plus. Vertical aiming 70-200. 3 hits. 9.30. Infantry attacks through the barrage Ludwig, supported by tanks. 10.20. They almost beat us. But during the past 20 minutes a hail of bombing rained down on the woods in front of us. One heavy one was dropped 200 meters from the main line of artillery positions. The ground shook. The forest was covered with clouds of smoke from the explosion. 10.25. The Rede are attacking. Our fighters destroyed 4 Russian machines in 3 minutes. 10.30. And again tanks. Anti-tank guns are firing like mad. 10.35. Look out, fighters. A new attack. Report. A tank has been hit. The 3rd victim of our little gun today. 10.37. New concentration of fire on B. 15 horse-drawn wagons, and a company. Orders to fire. Charge number 6. Percussion fuses. All guns. 10.45. Our dive bombers on the left. Repelling in front of us. Behind. Heavily burning Tabrakovo. Black smoke and red fire. 11.00. The 4th tank is hit by our 50mm anti-tank gun. A 76mm accounted for a couple more. A total of 13 in our battalion sector. 12.00. Today, the communication line to the firing position was fine for exactly 5 minutes. Then it was torn to pieces again. Now it's melting in the fire at Tabrakov. We continue to adjust the fire by radio. Hello, Red 1. Give me a report. 12.20. The 14th tank has already been set on fire, the 5th, by our small anti-tank gun. A direct hit on the big gun put it out of action. 2 tanks broke through, but 88mm guns got them before T-deserter. The Russians just arrived from Moscow yesterday. Put everyone from 14 to 50 under arms. A few days ago, we took 1 prisoner who was only 13. 15.30. The fighting is subsiding. The dive bombers are making their 6th or 7th raid. The tanks have withdrawn into the woods. As a result of our shooting very spectacularly, in chips, crushed trees, the debris of which frighteningly flew in different directions. There were supposed to be about 400 men in the forest in front of us. Probably they did not seem little at that moment. 17.00. A rocket barrage of fire, right above us. Dust and stench. We huddled even tighter to the ground. Shouts of Pabst. Meissner. All right. Keep firing. Our 3rd shot culminated in a perfect hit on the enemy artillery position. 16.45. The liaison officer returned with the news that our stingy-worded General Rita had been killed. In the evening, everything is quieted down. Machine gun fires tracer bullets. The Russians are withdrawing their surviving tanks. The others we've blown up. We stand at company headquarters and talk about the general. People used to curse him because he was very demanding. Now they say he was the epitome of the division. And this is a good division. He was a taciturn man, and he had iron stamina. They say the food was bad in the division. When he was served an exquisite dish, he would stare at it in silence for a while and then ask, "Is this what they give my infantry?" Such was our general. August 24, 1942. 4.15. The 3rd day of the battle. It simultaneously begins at once on the ground and in the air. 4.45. For an hour and a half there is a brutal hurricane fire in the sector on the left flank. Yesterday at 0.30, I returned to the firing position for a 2-day shift. Last night I had to go up again. Lieutenant D. Spengler was killed. A direct hit on the observation post. During the night we were building a dugout. I don't know what time it is now. One and the other of my watches went out of order in the course of the battle. I only know that the shelling has been going on since 4.45, and it is hard to believe that a few square meters of ground can withstand so much metal crushing it. 7.00. A short respite. Not so much shelling. We erected 2 dugouts, one as an observation post, the other for our radio operator, 80 meters to the rear. Several shells burst between them. They damaged our cable. One of the 120mm shells fell 3 meters from the radio communications dugout and shattered the beam over the entrance to the Christinaire. Lieutenant Mack and I looked like Negroes. We crawled between cabbage beds to fix the cable. Telephone communication was impossible in all that rumbling. They launched a mortar attack just as I got halfway up the hill. Carpet rocket fire came over me as I lay in a crater from a 120mm shell. The erection of the new observation post was completed just in time for morning. It's a miserable time, and quite wet. We have to crawl. After 10 minutes at the optical tube, my neck becomes stiff. But I'm glad we can observe this far out. We'll make up for it tonight. I can't wait for evening to come. Christiner just told me on the phone. I'm thinking the same thing. So far our little anti-tank gun has hit 5 tanks. Yesterday the regiment's tally was 58. One broke through today where Franz Wolf sat with the communicators in the sector on the left. Yesterday we shook hands when we met. At the battalion command post I was told about it 2 days later after he had had time to relay the report. Tanks. They're shooting. Then he ran up there with his telephone headset and everything else wrapped around him. He didn't hear the tanks until they were about 10 meters away from him. They've been advancing here now since the beginning of July. It's unbelievable. They must be taking terrible casualties. Fierce fighting is going on for every scrap of land. Day after day we're smashing their staging areas. They rarely manage to deploy their infantry, even within range of our machine guns. We see bomb craters. We see them dragging off the wounded. Their tanks stopped. Their airplanes shot down. They run around in fear and helplessness as our shells lay under their noses. But then they reappear, moving into the open and rushing into the forests, where they come under the strafing fire of our artillery and dive bombers. Of course, we also have losses, but they are incomparable to those of the enemy. 18.00. I determine the time by the sun. A new attack. It's on the left again. The tanks are rolling into the attack. And how? You can hear them quite clearly. You can almost see them creeping forward with a rattle, and guess with the accuracy of a second when they will reach our lines of defense and begin their yapping firing. But our artillery is already in action. The forest is covered with fiery bursts of shells and puffs of smoke. Machine guns crackle. The effect of the flying shrapnel must be terrible. Meanwhile, far behind us, anti-tank guns opened fire, but it lasted only between 15 and 30 minutes. Then it subsided. Now we hear the rumble of another tank attack. So far nothing is happening. Seconds pass, one after another, and not a single shot is fired. Don't open fire. Let them get closer. The optical tube shows a burning house. The smoke from the artillery bursts of fire drifts away like a fog. No visible movement on the enemy side. A little later, in the evening twilight, all hell broke loose again. Mortars, tanks, machine guns. But of all the attacking infantry, only a couple of defectors reached our positions. Then it was quiet again, and we spent the second night building our dugout. It now had a good roof, a solid protective layer of bricks, and an earth buffer against ricochets. We also dug a communication passage to crawl along between the two dugouts. August 24, 1942. The day started early with a shaving attack by fighter planes. In addition, rocket launchers opened fire, over which white fire spewed hourly at enemy positions in the woods. A few tanks and mortars sent us their morning dispatches intermixed, but in general it was quiet, and there was little movement on the enemy side. We even went outside a couple of times to sunbathe behind the dugout. 2 runs of 5 minutes each. A strange sight opens up when you stop for a moment at the entrance to the dugout. The guys are scattered in hiding places, behind broken garden hedges, in haystacks, in weedy fields, among the ruins of burnt houses. Occasionally, one would catch sight of someone waiting, bent over in a 3-degree crouch, along the road, his steel helmet gleaming for a moment. They are always at the ready, ready to stab quickly into cover. You can hear the click of a machine gun bolt, sometimes a short shriek. In general, in between the shelling, quiet, but you can feel the tension. Tonight I will be replaced. At dusk I went back. The last squadron was passing over the forest with the howling of sirens. The shelling had become more sensitive, the explosions more indiscriminate. In the sky, a sea of chaotic lights of tracer bullets and shells, volleys of Katyusha, and red, green, and white flashes, as if by magic, appeared in the gentle evening sky. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Then we were pelted with food, so that I could offer Franz Wolf some schnapps. Suddenly, we were all together, and it was nice to see the faces of good old comrades again. There is always something wonderful about meeting each other alive and well. Meissner was there waiting for his shift change at the post. Christiner asked, "They haven't shot you yet, buddy?" No? Well, then you're lucky. They made a hole in my tunic, Franz said. I just patched it up. So what? Look at my pistol holster, replied Meissner. We all agreed that it felt completely defenseless to be lying up there. But you're with all of us now, Christiner declared. When you're in company, you don't pay attention to what's going on, and you wouldn't want to be anywhere else. When I got back from their vacation, I found the 11th, but when they told me the battery was moving forward, everything was fine. I guess times are changing. Just now, the battery is firing a quick shot. The second this evening. The black smoke from the flamethrower charges means that the flame ejection is not always visible. The locks slam shut. Cartridges clink. Then again you hear the voice of the signalman. Hello, Red 2. We have nothing new here. Clear and clear, though almost monotonous. You can feel how well everyone is working together. The observers up there, the signalers, the gunners. Since yesterday, I have been back at the position of the advance watch. Last night I didn't sleep a wink. There is artillery fire from the enemy. Then our artillery opens fire. We strengthened our dugout even more. It's calmer today. Dust and smoke are still slowly drawn in through the entrance, but as long as a beam doesn't shift or a huge piece of earth doesn't fall into a soldier's cauldron, we don't particularly pay attention. The day is leaning toward evening. My steel helmet is getting heavy and my tongue is numb from excessive smoking. The sun peeks into the dugout. It's good to sip wine. I pick up the dusty bottle, hold it in the billowing, sunlit smoke, and admire the play of colors, green and red. What's not a Spanish Madonna with a mantle like this? My neighbor on the side is sprawled out and sleeping. In his sleep, his face is pale and suffering. I can see the stubble on his chin. We have a Russian burqa with which we cover our legs, and if we can, our ears. In fact, only one of us sleeps at any one time, but on a cold night, there is enough room under it for two. A little later, Lieutenant Mack and Klaas arrived, and Hans, and I went back out. We tightened the straps of our steel helmets and hurried out. It was not very pleasant to be in anticipation of a bullet when walking through a bare hill on a moonlit night. We wanted to leave it behind as soon as possible, to pass the numerous shell craters, the trampled, burnt and ridden bread field in front of T, the crossroads with gaping holes in the craters. The sentry at the anti-tank gun politely asked us the password. Then we passed a padded tank, and then the lowland where we always light a cigarette. Once again, I had my eye on target 215. At the intersection of roads were several positions of anti-aircraft artillery. A man appeared in the open, took off his overcoat, remained standing in a short-sleeved shirt in the bright sun, then wandered carelessly to the pond to bathe. "Reinhard," I said, "Reinhard, look at this, isn't it impertinent?" We were squatting, and we were itching to get into a fight. If only some gun had passed by. But the god of war was kind. Even two guns appeared. They came up, shakily but nimbly over the hill past point 235, and were moving toward 315. What luck! The order was given to open fire. Report ready. Fire. We waited. Here it comes. And then a mushroom cloud. Our Ivan was scared to death. A shell of 155mm caliber is not an Easter egg. He grabbed his tunic and disappeared into the shelter, raising a column of dust. The charioteers touched their horses and galloped away. We caught them at point 325. One of the horses was going around in a circle without a coachman, and we felt better. It was funny, Father. It cheered us up, and I thought of your stories about the Berezina. Didn't you do the same sort of thing yourself? You'd lie in wait and laugh. Look, now they're going to jump. You used to say. Mother was always angry about it. What a mean tribe you men are. But I know how you felt. In the morning I lay in my hole with a slight fever. I dreamed of a peaceful sleep under my mother's protection, a sleep in which I could let go of everything that stresses me so much, like this constant existence waiting to be summoned. A dream after which I could wake up smiling. A dream that would not be one long restless sleep. As it always happens, from about 4 o'clock, the earth began to crumble, penetrating through the thatched roof planking of the dugout. Sometimes it fell quite profusely, as if the rafters were shaking themselves. At times I wondered whether I should not turn over and lie with my head towards the exit, where there was probably more room, as a last resort. But I, gripped by fever, was too indifferent to care. I only squirmed even more. At 8 o'clock there were 10 hits around our little group of dugouts. The beams and the layer of earth above my entrance are in cracks. The motorcycle that had been standing there was now useless, and its splinter had punctured a food crate, littering the contents with sawdust. During the afternoon, both sides intensified air action. From all directions, huge hawks streamed into the center of the battle, and fighters circled around them. For half an hour, we watched attacks and pursuits taking place at 3 different levels. A formation of dive bombers was dive bombing very close to a squadron of Russian fighters. They bravely rushed down, plane after plane. High overhead, the shells of the anti-aircraft guns carried on in search of their victims, while below them, the fighters pursued the flaming bombers relentlessly. It seemed as if the combined efforts of the armies and air forces were gradually concentrating on this dirty little piece of ground. This went on until deep into the night. To the north, the ridges of clouds were on fire as usual. Ahead of us, the battlefield was girded with flashes bursting from gun barrels, and the ground was humming with explosions. Over all this loomed a sky with cold twinkling stars. Sometimes one might believe that life in this zone would cease, and yet it continues in 1,000 human beings, trembling, wary, hoping to stay alive. Yesterday at 4 o'clock the enemy again opened a hurricane fire, but our dive bombers did not take long to attack him. We attacked with some success in our own section, in spite of stubborn resistance. The battery was in action all night. This morning the reenactors joined us. Hoseman was walking with his cauldron to get coffee when it started. He stopped like a dumbfounded man. "Jesus," he said, "the lion's cage has opened." It is indeed a diabolical, horrible roar as the rockets fly upward. Flanders returned from vacation yesterday. He said, 19 months is a long time, though I know some people have to wait even longer. I felt a lot of timidity when I walked through the city, no exaggeration. You get used to it already. There are big stone buildings and wide streets and gardens and parks. It's all so unreal, like you don't belong to this world anymore. Then you get to your house, assuming it's still there. A sofa to stretch out on with a book, a desk lamp, a radio. And no shooting, none at all. It's night. I lie in my shelter with a fever and right between coughing fits. Outside. Movement, footsteps, a call. "Hello, still here." Edu appears. He's back from the front lines with caked mud, overgrown with a stiff, stubbly beard. He stretches out across my legs and says, "Mate, what we've been through." The dugout was destroyed. 1 shell of 70th caliber. We almost got completely swept away. But we're all in one piece. 5 times Ivan was going to attack. 5 times there was an artillery preparation, and 5 times his infantry did not move. The place was practically open. We had to dig in with machine guns. "Do you have a drink?" We talked about whether it was good to have some kind of internal support when experiencing hurricane fire. One thing we established is that atheists have a harder time with this, because there are times when the inner strength of resistance in everyone runs out. In these kinds of situations, it is good when one still has another force to support him. That is why a religious person should not be robbed of his faith. For the same reason, young people are not always the most reliable, although nothing can be said in advance. It has already been proven that one cannot truly judge a person unless one has seen him under fire. There are people who become almost cheerful. They have a heightened sense of humor in almost critical situations. These people are the salt of the earth. Despite your restraint, reading your letters, I notice a hidden concern in them. What exactly is my attitude towards death? People try to avoid discussing such matters. Death is always there. Its presence is so obvious that it is impossible to see it. For this reason, we have long ago defined our attitude to it. Some people have a panic fear of death and cherish the hope that it will pass them by. So they are torn between hope and fear. They pale in the face of danger. Most people just don't think about it. They put it out of their minds. It will be all right, they think, and take the risk without avoiding danger beyond what their duty dictates. Death in battle is an unnatural death. It is true that the opposite theory is the foundation of Quentin's teaching. Quentin was wrong in this. To give our lives for our country, to die in such a way that humanity will live on in the minds of the people, is not our only calling. What matters is that the willingness to die not be lost, because that nation where people have forgotten death is doomed to decline. But it is also true that each of us still has many hopes, aspirations, and desires, many things that are beyond sudden death. We nurture unborn works that have yet to be created. It is just in these years, when all our talents, with the exception of the military, lie dead weight, when we still have so much to do. To finish the work of one's life is another duty, and not the smallest of those which a man must fulfill for his country. So it seems to me that it is not at all meant that we should accept death as something natural, simply as an attribute of the natural course of development. That would mean that we are precluded in advance, that we would not be guided by any other thought, that without this final consummation our life would be useless. Death in battle is a glorious consummation of a man's life, but it is not the only one. The loss to his people and country can be made up for. No one is eternal, not even the best of us. New generations will arise, and to them will pass on all our strength and all our abilities, insofar as man knows how to die. Each individual must continue the struggle, realizing that the realization of his own potentialities can take place. If one risks life, as if to regain it every day and appreciate it even more, if one is on the verge of death, because the game of dagger with fate excites, one recognizes death as the natural conclusion of one's life, and even in death, one finds satisfaction, getting relief at last in it. If dangerous life is only a period in life, and the imprint of its charms is imprinted on everyone, then death in battle is only one of many possible outcomes. It is a premature end. It is not accepted with indifference, but it can be accepted in cold blood. It can be met calmly and with composure, with the dignity that accompanies a conscious attitude to life, and with the desire to inflict the greatest damage on the enemy, to sell one's life as dearly as possible, to fulfill one's stern duty to the end. But it is not so much the thought of our own death that moves us as the fear for the lives of those we love. We feel confident in our own strength and proud that we have escaped death. One feels equal to the danger that one can look into the eyes of, even if it proves too great to confront, and the wave of darkness that envelops our consciousness collapses briefly. But once the danger is behind us, we plunge back into life. On these moonlit nights, a transparent mist hangs among the fir trees, and the silvery grass creaks underfoot. The second winter of our stay here is approaching. Surely the lessons of the first winter will be heeded by us. But more than ever we will need our courage and perseverance, as well as our fortitude to live without illusions, because what we are doing is a thankless job. We have to stand or fall. This is a ruthless war. September 25, 1942. Everything is exactly the same as it was last year, when we stood in front of the settlement of Billy, when we built our first shelter in the wall, and made a pipe of peat bricks. Since that time we had succeeded in something. We had inserted several tin cans one into the other, and we had also removed the exhaust pipe from a downed Russian bomber. But the dimensions of the hearth remained the same, 1 shovel bayonet wide, 1 high, and 2 deep. The chimney always smokes first. Then the ground dries up, the wood begins to crackle, and we indulge in memories. The way back, yes. Do you remember? Today I went back to the battery. At the entrance to the dugout, Schmuck was sitting over a bucket of boiling potatoes. I took a couple of potatoes, peeled them from their thin skins. They were wonderful and hot, but I only felt it after I had taken a walk the day before. I realized what a delight it was to eat potatoes. I was completely satisfied, and it occurred to me again how much we have come to appreciate the little joys. I am once again acting as the forward observer. I was to replace someone farther up on the right flank, and the new order caught me when I was on my way. We had not traveled much that night with our gear and equipment, and it was not very easy to walk with a load on our backs and another on our chests. In rubber boots like divers' flippers, through mud and puddles, through that sickly bush, where you have to watch all the time not to lose the right direction. But every road ends somewhere. The Bavarian unit holds the position. The fire line stretches across the bare countryside. The line is narrow and fairly dry on the hills, but in the lowlands it is filled with water. You have to squelch through muddy water. Machine gun firing points are pushed forward like little bastions. They keep under fire in front of the adjacent terrain, dotted with hollows with bushes. Everywhere. Hit tanks. It seems as if our position was a kind of breakwater, taming the wave like a giant armada washed ashore. Here on the hill, the position is well equipped. There are drainage ditches, the mud is held back, and the water is clear enough for washing up and washing walks. Short trenches lead to latrines and garbage pits. A message passage connects us to the rear. The only trouble is that the dugouts are shallow because of the high water level. You have to walk ducking down, taking cover behind the ledge of the trench if you want to dodge a bullet. There are 2 men in one trench, and one can only crawl over the other. Sitting upright is impossible, neither upstairs nor downstairs. Even on the sides there is not a meter of free space. Every movement becomes a procedure. The floor is covered with straw. That's all we have besides a narrow shelf where we put our provisions and a niche for the phone. I've moved my tablet and binoculars behind my back. Everything else is in the front. It's cold. We place a candle between 2 herring tins to heat tea in a mug. When we go to bed, we pull a blanket over our heads and keep each other warm. I walked around the position. The sun was shining. In a secluded corner, the first machine gun crew was catching lice and scraping dirt off their overcoats with a knife. From time to time, a mortar fired. One of the soldiers was hit by a shell. A dark puddle of blood began to form, and he lay there moaning. His comrades held his head, carefully bringing a mug to his lips. One of them spoke to the wounded man as a mother speaks to her child. "Drink, you will feel better. Don't worry. They will come for you now. They will come at once, Alfred, instantly." At dusk I was standing in the trench checking radio communications. Something was out of order. I turned the tuning a little and suddenly caught a German radio station on short waves. The commander of the platoon was passing by, and we let him listen to it. An operetta. How strange it was to hear it. As soon as it got dark, we started to build a new dugout. Slowly, the magnifying glass rose. The brittle grass crunched underfoot. The weapons turned frosty. During a pause, I sauntered over to Fieldfebel Rath, who was doing forward observer duty on my right. He had just returned from vacation, and I wanted to know if Frankfurt was still standing. I also wanted to hear the story of how he had almost landed in the enemy camp a few days before. It was pretty easy, he told me. Here I was getting close, moving along a line of sparse shrubbery. But I didn't get to the line I wanted, but to the one that goes through a swampy lowland and ends in the battle area. There was no trench there, and I could see no swamp, but I could see a few dugouts. I was on my way to my own when someone called out to me. I couldn't understand what was said to me. The voice sounded kind of funny. I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Brady, Brady." Dan, I thought, Brady, Brady. That's something wrong. I quickly turned around. 10 meters away from me, someone in a food truck asked me, should I move on? What can you say? When we were already 50 meters away from the place, I said to my men, "Didn't you stupid morons see that it was the Russians?" Ivan didn't fire a single shot. It was unbelievable. But then they rasped our own trench, and a couple of machine guns opened fire. I threw myself on the ground and kept calling until someone shouted, "Hey!" Finally, we got to the trench, but for a while the rascals, didn't want to believe we were Germans. I stood at the first machine gun, waiting for the artillery preparation that would precede our attack. The operation began minute by minute. Soon afterward, a squadron of dive bombers appeared. The ground was covered with the explosions of shells of all calibers. Dark gray-white smoke rose in a dark purple cloud, slowly drifting away in a westerly direction. Directly opposite the sun rose mushroom-shaped clouds from the next bursts. One after another they rose, taking on bizarre shapes, then in the form of a cabbage stalk, then in the shape of the tips of jets, then a clenched fist. All the time dive bombers dived into the smoke, and through the eyepieces were seen huge clods of earth, flying into the air. The shaft of fire rushed forward toward the enemy's rear areas. Individuals were seen first, and then groups of men retreating back. But there were still yellow flashes bursting from the barrels of tank guns, and again a cloud in the east which indicated that a strafing rocket fire was in progress. Our batteries responded with intense barrage fire. Toward evening, we reached our objective, and the enemy visibly drooped. My shift arrived with a couple of wagons loaded with logs. It was so quiet that we could drive straight to the dugout. Everyone said hello by the hand. The stanchions and boards were piled quickly and quietly, and soon the wagons were away again and melted away like ghosts in the moonlight. At 4, we hung up the cloak tent in front of the entrance and lit the first fire in the stove. At 4:30, we walked back, barely moving our heavy legs, dead tired. October 2, 1942. The forward observer reported 2 hits from heavy mortars. The dugout is so badly damaged that it can no longer be used. No casualties. All our work has been for nothing. All right, we'll build a new dugout. Evening. Next month, I'll have to live in this dugout alone. That is, when I go back to the battery again. I'm glad. I'm so happy when I'm alone. This morning, Edu woke me up just because he wanted to chat, and I was so tired. In the evening, the pariahs sit up to talk about their problems. Sometimes I tactfully have to get rid of them. I have so much to do, and when there's not much work to do, sometimes I want to read a book. You can't give all your time to talking. I want to make myself a bread and margarine sandwich and meditate. Most people don't seem to share this need to be alone with me, but solitude has never been a burden to me. In any case, I am virtually never alone. There is a stove that sings in its own way, and there's a mouse that lives upstairs among the boards. They are my friends with whom I talk. Today, the new forward observation post to dugout is finished and ready for occupancy, probably confirming the news of the imminent advance, with a shift arriving to deliver the last load of planks for the second roof deck. We've managed to spend the last 3 days peacefully. Nothing much had happened. Perhaps we didn't even smell gunpowder. Anyway, our trench is deep. As for the types creeping up at night with machine guns and the horizontal machine gun fire, these are all mosquito bites. We are used to them and hardly hear them. A light anti-tank gun of the Russians shattered one of our machine gun firing positions, and the trench was showered with earth dislodged from the berm. But as the machine gun itself is only there at night, we laughed it off. Too bad I was in a neighboring sector, shooting the target at range, or I would have shown him, that little upstart. The next day, however, I fired heavily on it, and it went silent. It didn't require much artillery. We were only 400 meters apart, but it was an impressive moment, because the Russians saw me, and I gave them a lot of trouble. Fortunately, I had already been given the command to fire, and for the rest of the day they showed no further signs of their presence. It is difficult to hit these anti-tank guns. They change position all the time. They move forward, fire a few shots, and disappear before you realize it. If you're not in position when you give the command to fire, you won't be able to hit them in time. I walk along the line of field fortifications in the pleasant company of our bearded fighters. Some have indeed grown beards, long beards that would do honor to a submariner. They are restless. Look who's here, our artillery reconnoiter. Come here, my boy, I'll show you something. This is where you're to suppress a firing point just over there. And next time, lad, if it isn't the fact that you have to fire 20 shots there for me, I'll come and melt the stove myself to heat your dugout. Come on, let's pin the old Ivan's tail a little. I got a sniper rifle. We lay side by side, one with binoculars, the other looking through the telescopic sight. Early in the morning, I was walking along the trench and came across a sentry, a small man with a round face under a steel helmet. He stood there alone, shrinking from the cold, shuffling from foot to foot. Some men jumped out of the dugout, tall, thin guys with red beards. They greeted each other in a friendly manner. Got a cigarette left, old boy? The short man asked. Sure you do, said the lanky one, smiling. Wait a second, I'll get one. You know, said the sentry, as he went away, we're great friends. We can't be divided by water. His round face shone, and he was happy that I was standing there to rejoice in this great and beautiful human feeling. The tall one came back, and they both leaned against the wall of the trench, puffing alternately on a cigarette. Look here, I thought. It is no longer unusual for one man to go into the fire for another. It is so simple and self-evident. I rode back in total darkness. The rain was whipping in my face. When we weren't sure if we were on the right road, the horses found their own way. I found my lonely dugout, where I found the mail and a stack of firewood left by a comrade. The last evening in a dugout at an old artillery firing position. My comrades read, I write. The hot stove is red hot. There is a supply of schnapps. In the cauldron is water from the nearest puddle. We want to make grog. I only have to bend over a little to pick up the logs between my legs. Everything is at hand. No need to get up from my seat. A mouse has raised a fuss among the boards, gnawing at them, and sawdust flies down. Sometimes I take a chip and poke it in the holes, and then it's quiet for a while. It's almost the only thing that disturbs our peace. Nothing can stir us up anymore. I do not say this for bravado, but in a calm and sensible, indifferent way. Whatever happens, it's not likely to surpass what we've already experienced. When I think about it, I almost want to say, the enemy is no longer capable of launching such assaults. What gave us trouble last winter was not Russian infantry, but special Siberian detachments. Now we can say on the basis of the experience gained here, the enemy no longer has such detachments. Every assault has to be preceded by intensive artillery preparation and extensive use of armored vehicles if he wants to have a chance of success. Even so, his infantry has been unable to advance, and what he has not been able to achieve so far, he will not achieve in the coming winter. He can probably break through here and there, but he won't be able to consolidate his success. For us, it's just a matter of patience, resilience, and perseverance. None of these qualities are outstanding or the sort of thing you can make a lot of noise about, but each of them requires more of a man in the long run than any attack requires. Attack inspires. It breeds a desperate fighter. Defense is not as glorified, but it makes you resilient. It is harder to lie under fire waiting for an attack than it is to burst through a curtain of fire and knock the enemy out. The attacker is intoxicated with excitement. He has no sense of danger. It is he who determines the course of action. The defender has to wait. He does not know what he will face. His resistance may be fierce, but there is no enthusiasm. It rains all day long. It rained when we were whistled out of our beds at 4 o'clock in the morning. It rained when the guns were taken off the front, and when we followed the artillery squad and the signal team. We overtook the battery and came forward to take up a new position. It was now 8:00 p.m. The guns had not yet arrived, but the rain was continuing. I stood on the back seat of the mobile radio station, holding my sore leg in the balance and looking at my comrades, whose wet clothes clung tightly to my body. Rain and snow beat in their faces, and an icy wind blew into their wet raincoats. The charioteers sat on the high seats of their wagons with stiffened hands and discontented faces. Their heads were bowed sideways. Thus they drove through the terrible mud, pushing their wagons through water and swamp, plowing like clumsy, heavily laden vessels, shaking and swaying over the potholes and pits of the highway. The surface of the planks sometimes showed from the depths of the mud, and the drainage ditches were overflowing. In the worst parts of the low-lying swamp, a second layer of fascines, like a band-aid, was placed on top. In spite of the fastenings, it was so elastic and full of bulges that the soul was torn out of the body, and all the time an effort had to be made not to fall overboard. This is what a freeway is, a straight, clear-edged road, the fruit of hard and considerable labor, unlike other roads, which are like rushing streams. But sometimes even the freeway goes out of its boundaries. This happens on downhill gradients, where wagons veer off to the side, and the charioteers have to see if they will get to safety without injury. On such a gradient, a light howitzer approached us from behind on a steep grade. It caught up with us at the very bottom, by a long stretch of water which had to be traversed at speed. It was a spectacle of mobilization of strength as 3 men and 6 horses surmounted the obstacle. I saw the leading rider in the saddle. On the peasant face of this lad, I caught the same expression that one gets when a harness traverses a field. There was the same love, the same calm patience with which generations of peasants have plowed the furrow in snow and rain, in sun and wind. Straight, disciplined, steady. He spoke the same language that his ancestors used to speak to their domestic animals. He rested the same peasant fists on his loins and displayed the same equanimity, enduring hunger and thirst and all manner of hardships. Only this is a different plow and different seeds that these young peasants in steel helmets are sowing into the future. The dugout is almost 9 meters deep. You get into it through narrow passages on steep steps. They have up to 6 layers of logs on the ceiling. They are roomy inside. You can see that they didn't skimp on the materials or the labor put in. Our own is the smallest, and there are only 4 of us in it. It is a blockhouse, which was smashed to pieces and is slowly being rebuilt. It has 3 layers of logs after a layer of earth, a deep shaft down to the window, and a wooden floor. The bunks and walls are made of light, smooth wood. They are pleasing to the eye. A shelf, table, chairs, and stools complete the furnishings. The guns are located in the vegetable gardens between the rows of houses. Their thunder booms between the ruins and ruins of dilapidated shacks. Camouflage from air attacks is not a problem. We are hard to detect. Our supplies are not bad. If we are forced to stay in these dugouts, we can survive a second winter. The shoemaker built us a stove yesterday. The wheelwright helped him. You should see them, the 2 comrades. The shoemaker did his work so lovingly that it was impossible to tear him away. He measured and laid each brick, explained everything, and caulked the gaps with clay. His rough hands gently smoothed the sharp edges, and he said, "Here, here, and so, with each brick laid in place, as if he were working a spell. He did his best. You could see it. Would it be all right like this? Is it wide and high enough? Yes? He put a sheet of iron underneath. It'll be better. Would the door be all right? And the stovepipe? His face, with cheeks like 2 apples, with childish eyes, bent with vivacity over the hole, which began to look solid among the bricks and clay. Marusa had to call for him 3 times before he came to lunch. And then the chimney. That wasn't easy at all. It had to be discussed properly. Both of them got quite heated in the argument. The cobbler with his high voice, and the toothless wheelwright with his grumbling bass. But they both huffed and puffed, excavating the earth and digging a passage for the pipe. We have a small pan with a handle. It's got all the equipment for an extra kitchen in the dugout. Other times Dola and Marusha bring us boiled potatoes and put them in a basin on the table, which is much easier. Their mother was washing the dugout this morning. She started doing the dirty work of her own free will. Believe it or not, she even remembered to wipe the legs of the chairs. It's not that all the dirt on the legs had disappeared. It had set in thoroughly. But it was possible that by the time Christmas came, it would have succumbed to a second attack. When she had finished, She asked if we would like a tablecloth, and proudly pulled out a piece of wallpaper. They are certainly beautiful. They're not quite new anymore, but the underside is still white. I brushed off a dried-up bedbug. Now the tablecloth is spotless. Meanwhile, the bathhouse is heated. It's in the middle of the firing position, 40 paces from our dugout. I went there, limping, some time ago. It's really just a laundry, but it's very warm and bright. The water is boiling in a steam boiler, and a suitable disinfection chamber will soon free us from our little partisans. Russia is, as it were, a clean country. Very clean. At the door I saw 2 women, each carrying a couple of buckets on a wooden pail. They asked in a friendly manner, "Comrade, to wash." They were going to follow me for nothing. It reminds me of a story about a traveler in Russia. Russia is the cleanest country in the world. You arrive at a Moscow train station, and immediately a girl comes up and asks, "Would you like to wash up, sir?" If you say yes, they are very nice to you. They wash your back and rub your breasts. And when you come out of there, another one stands waiting. "Shall I wash, sir?" Truly, Russia is the cleanest country in the world. But we declined the offer. German Nichtskultur. Calm October days. It rains very often, but now the days are filled with faint sunshine and the breath of Indian summer. At night, when the magnifying glass rises above the oblong ridge of clouds, its light is reflected by the damp walls of ruins and sloping roofs. The noise can be heard from afar, and when you stand at night by the dark barrels of the guns, it seems as if you could touch the front with both hands, and yet its noise hardly breaks the silence in my dugout, where I dwell, now mostly alone. Others are on vacation or over the Volga. There is a lot of construction work going on at the moment. How much this solitude means to me. I can spread out all over my desk with books and writing utensils. I can move around as I please without discussing my movements with anyone. I don't need to show politeness. I don't need to listen to anyone or plug my ears, so I can't hear conversations. What bliss! I love being alone so much. I can't get deep enough into myself. There is no such thing as too much of this peace. I tell myself I just need to pick myself up and find a few kind words, and I can make someone happy. I can give something more precious than anything in times like these, a little love and warmth. That's all it takes, because we all have hard times, and that's why we need to feel the touch of a hand sometimes. We live because of love. A few kind words are sometimes hard to give. Hard because words are little comfort when we don't know what to do. Hard because we can't spare you from worrying about us. Doubt and worry seep through every letter, no matter how optimistic. I feel them growing. But what can I do? I can only stretch out my arms and say again, "Look, here I am. I am smiling, and I am right beside you. Can you feel my confidence? Even if my voice is not the same as it was a few days ago, I am still living for you in this moment, just as you are living for me. I'm still here, Mom, very close to you. You'll feel it if you freeze for a moment. Don't you feel it?" Marusha brought a letter. It's a little strange when you start thinking about it in an artillery position. The little girl was curious. I had to open it at once, but for all that it was typewritten, she couldn't understand at all what it said. Everything in Germany is done on machines. Funny country. Can't your father write? I laughed so hard. How was I supposed to explain it? My knowledge of Russian still leaves a lot to be desired. I sit and sweat over the Russian alphabet and those awful hissing sounds. The ch and the shish and the sh and the sh. Sometimes she sits next to me and I become the student. I went for a walk on this lovely October morning. Just a short walk. I was like a recovering patient with no other purpose than to observe and absorb and enjoy my very being here. I wandered through the suburbs and down a broken street to the Volga, the bank of which is dotted with dugouts, and beyond which the front line is no longer so far away. I met a woman with a pail carrying buckets in which they carry water from the river. There are only a few wells here. They used to have a barrel, a horse, and a cart. Now they carry water in buckets and put a cabbage leaf on the surface of the water to keep it from splashing. There's no running water, of course. I almost forgot to mention that. It's a completely wild idea. Only a foreigner would think of such a thing. In one place, the soldiers were demolishing a house. The roof collapsed, and the mossy roof tiles slid to the ground. Clouds of dust rose. Rafters collapsed. It was a quick job. But little was left of the house before they had even begun. The front had been breached, and fragments of the frame hung swaying in the wind. Only the Dutch oven in all its white splendor survived. Now it stands, cold and lonely, in the open air. How different the town was when the front came upon it. What an entirely different landscape it presents. Beams, planks, cobblestones and wires, abandoned household utensils, craters and trenches. You walk through it cautiously. It's like a ghost, even in the sunlight. Life is again crammed into dens and cellars, cellars whose windows are boarded up with wooden boards and sheets of iron. Occasionally remnants of window glass are visible, allowing scant rays of light to penetrate the musty twilight. And yet they hold on, old men, women, and children. They are the strong ones, timid, haggard, good-natured, shameless, as the circumstances dictate. The old man steps aside, muttering, touching his hat with a drooping gaze. The passage through the mud on the road is narrow. A little girl walks toward the river, the shawl on her head scarlet as a poppy. An old man ties a straw around his hat because it will soon be cold. How simple. A few planks, 1 or 2 logs, and the outer step is ready. The straw is laid between them. He drags it in his tattered sack. God knows where he got it from. In winter you build a second stove, and with the coming of summer you take it apart again. If there's no door, you take wood and an axe. You do everything with it, joints and all, and everything holds. You don't need nails or bricks, just an axe and wood. This amazing craftsmanship exists side by side with what's left of the factories. Above it all rise the green domes and slender spires of churches, white, gleaming, forgotten, broken. How to combine all this? Little cultured, rambling, inscrutable people. There is an old man with metal-rimmed glasses and a well-groomed beard. In his clean room, the samovar gleams merrily. There is my laundress, who saw her eldest son off to Germany, and now only has to feed his younger brother. She does not take her eyes off her laundry until she has ironed it. She darned my sweatpants and a pair of underpants, though I didn't even ask her to do that. The little boy is modest and friendly. Then there is the boy who buried his mother in the garden behind the house, the way they bury animals. He tamped the ground without uttering a word, without tears, without putting up a cross or a stone. There is the priest's wife, almost blind from tears. Her husband was deported to Kazakhstan. She has 3 sons who are unknown where they are now. God only knows. Their pictures show intelligent faces. Where is the key to all this? It's not just a question of establishing order here. The world has collapsed, and the natural order of things was disrupted a long time ago.